So this is my PPT using the theme of this meeting. I visited MIT many times when I taught at Harvard, but that was more than 10 years ago. And I'm so glad that you have all the opportunity to connect with MIT. So what I'm trying to, I've listened to all your reports, and what I'm going to say may not fit your purpose or may not fit the reality in your schools, but I'll try my best. Now they are talking about new normals and next normals. This is McKinsey, a new abnormal, another meeting, uncertain normal, uncertain new normal. Anyway, everything is against normal anyway. We cannot pretend we know what will come next. Change is the only normal, but this is not only change. We're talking about change for decades. Is uncertainty is the only normal. That is change, but uncertain. So that is unprecedented, I would say, for educators. The chronology in Hong Kong is suspension of class since 27th of January. I'm not so sure you remember. We are, until now, we are actually having the longest time of suspension of classes. Many societies started their suspension of classes or what they call school closed down later. China, which has started earlier than us a few weeks, but now has resumed class almost normally. The general situation is higher education goes into e-learning very smoothly. Primary and secondary schools unprepared, but move into e-learning almost online learning almost 100% everywhere. Kindergartens are the most affected, victimized by because you have to rely on activity, rely on parents, and so on and so forth. But anyway, I'll concentrate on this part. Now, my understanding, to test my understanding with you. Phase one is reluctance. Right? We really don't know what to do. What we are trying to do, is to duplicate what we do in classrooms online, which we will discuss further. Acceptance as long-term adaptation. We know that it is no longer a makeshift temporary measure. It has to go on. And then suddenly in all schools, there's a mushrooming of innovations. And then we have since last September, semi-resumption of classes. We don't know what will happen next. In some of the countries in Europe, they are talking about end of the coronavirus until the end of next year. It's much longer than we expected. Now, what have we achieved? Teachers adapted and learned with unbelievable speed. Some said that they presume they planned that the teacher would learn to use technology freely in about 3 years or 5 years training, but it happened in Hong Kong in 2 weeks. So teachers are great learners. Second is teachers become learning designers. Think of it. It's not just instructors, because all that we have in mind are students learning. We can no longer control them under our eyes, under our nose. So we have to think, what are they doing? Are they learning? And we become learning designers, which is not very usual. And the third thing about what we have achieved is teachers become controllers of learning technologies. It used to be in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, in Macau, in mainland China, all these Chinese communities, and even in some of the other chopstick cultures like Korea and Japan, the use of technology is basically initiated by the technology providers. You can do this. We have this new device, so you can do this. You should do this. But teachers are not very responsive. In Hong Kong, although Hong Kong has a very high penetration rate of technologies, devices, mobile phones, and so on and so forth, but the application in education is very low. By PISA, which is the international comparison, Hong Kong is very low, almost in the last 10 societies in about 75 countries. Technology is now serving learning. Some teachers told me that we have 18 devices, apps to choose from, and so on and so forth. I think this is quite common. But what have we discovered? It's not possible to duplicate classroom with online learning. I think this is for sure. It's a totally different, I won't say totally different, but it is actually totally different, although we pretend it's not different. As it is hardly realistic to follow the traditional schedule. But some schools, I wouldn't say all, some schools still try very hard to cover the syllabus, to follow the original plan, which is difficult. And we have to think of, if it is difficult, if it's not realistic, what can we think of that? What we've discovered is students can be active learners. I say can be. I won't say every one of them is learning actively, but there are all kinds of cases to show the possibilities that students, when they left alone, they can be active learners. They can not only be active learners following our curriculum, they can also be active learners with learning beyond the curriculum. This is an unusual window for experimenting self-directed learning for students. We talk about self-directed learning all the time, and it has been almost the basic theme of any education reform. But this is an opportunity. They are forced to be self-directed learners. What can we do? What I have discovered is also that school social learning and group activities are so essential. We miss them, are so essential. Face-to-face interactions, implicit learning has been taken for granted. We thought, oh, schools are like this, and everybody, you go to school every morning, we meet the students meet themselves, and so on and so forth. But now it cannot be taken for granted. But we found that it's so precious, so irreplaceable. And therefore, but the last thing that we've discovered, which is the downside, is disparity in family learning environments. Computers, internet coverage, the hardware, the living conditions, limited space, and also parental support, family harmony. The first line may not apply to parents of your schools here, because I presume your parents here are slightly more equipped, but there are families where the parental support is lacking and family harmony is not there. So there's an urgent need to remedy. What I'm proposing to the government is that there should be new standard for learning equipment. It used to be equipment only in classrooms. Equipment should be for individuals. The government does have a kind of bring your own device project, but it's not enough. And providers are not helping in rare, in sparsely populated places. There's no Wi-Fi coverage. And the difficulties they are facing is beyond our imagination. And therefore, it's all about learning. And you will say, what is the constancy? Learning is the constancy. Learning is a human instinct. But unfortunately, education is not. Education is designed, human beings designed for human beings, kind of a systematic learning, systematic learning, and it carries with the economic, political, cultural, and religious characteristics of that time, which means that education can be obsolete, and we are facing that crisis, that challenge. So what is the new normal? I would say that it's all about learning. Again, the old normal is you have traditional learning, which occupies the largest portion of our students' time, and then a little bit of self-directed learning. Perhaps this square is larger in your schools, but also social learning in schools, on campus, or experiential learning outside campus. But now, the new normal is likely to be traditional learning very much reduced. Self-directed learning expands, whether you like it or not, whether it's within curriculum or not, but the social learning becomes more important and should be enriched. So my elaboration of this is traditional learning, there's examination requirement. I don't think we can do without it in foreseeable future. It's person-to-person instruction, which is important according to new science of learning. You know that human beings relate to each other not only by symbols. Basic knowledge and skills have to be done very traditionally, perhaps, but has to be reduced because much of that could be taken up by self-study. If our teaching is basically about facts and information, they will be taken up by self-study. It also tells us that, therefore, traditional teacher-student interaction should not be limited to facts and information. Self-directed learning will expand. Online learning, elective learning, learning for self-interest. I'm not talking about web-based learning at all. It's about students learning on their own. It's much more than just online learning. It could be reading books. It could be learning a new technique of something, or production of something new. Should be very much expanded and beyond the curriculum. In fact, many schools are already doing this, leaving room for students. In most schools in Hong Kong, students' time are basically occupied totally by schools. And this has to be changed. The third one is about social learning. I give it the name social learning. It's about friendship, about group activities, about community life, about experiential learning, implicit learning. And should be very much enriched beyond campus and across cultures. Now, across cultures are not so sure, so easy now, but it will come. So if that is the case, what have to be changed? It's again about learning. Change the discourse from teaching to learning. I think this is done in many schools in Hong Kong now, although in reality, teaching still overwhelms school lives. Second, the assessment of learning becomes essential. Essential, not that we have to assess what they learn, it's the whole notion about assessment. When you talk about learning in a different mode, people will say, yes, so what is the learning outcome? How do we measure it? But I'm not so sure all learning can be measured. All learning can be measured on the spot, immediately after learning. All the learning can be assessed as a separate part of knowledge. So learning is not, assessment is not only about contents. We have to change from what do they know to what can they do. Let them produce something, let them create something in groups and so on and so forth. I will not elaborate. Many schools are already doing this, but doing it consciously as a new part of a new normal is essential. The third is shifting the emphasis from knowledge and skills to social and emotional learning. Now, social and emotional learning is not a very encompassing term, but I'm using it as a proxy. Some of the reports I just heard from Logos in particular is about social and emotional learning. It's learning beyond the cognitive domain. It's so important. I'll explain slightly later. But what is not paid attention to is we have to learn to understand both the real world and the virtual world. Children and adults as well are living in two worlds, two societies, the real society and the virtual society. And they are very different things. A lot of students' value system, their notion about society, about government, about the world, about future are shaped by the virtual the virtual community they joined. But this is what I thought of about learning. But may I end by a small introduction of why are we doing this? Is it only because of pandemic? No, society has changed. Everybody knows. But what has changed is a fragmented society. We call it the VUCA society, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. And because of the fragmentation, it's an individualized generation. Individuals are on their own. Working units are getting smaller and smaller. People are no longer attached to a large organization, pyramidal, where their own characteristics, their own knowledge and skills can be protected by the organization. No protection, insecure, unstable, although freer, more independent, more autonomous, and more unconventional. I think we are facing this generation because they are facing, this is the reality of society they're facing. They have to be adaptive, to be aggressive, innovative. It's not only the elite should be like this, everybody should be. But with COVID-19, the economic downturn is even more severe. The economic downturn is global and comprehensive. I don't have the time to explain. It's not that, oh, after the COVID, when the COVID ends, society will go back to the old time. Everything will be restored. I don't think so. No society could be exceptional. There's a real sense of crisis. Society even more fragmented. Individuals, less jobs, less income, even more insecure, but independent. Our next generation, therefore, has to be stronger because they cannot go with a credential, they go into a job and be there for life and be protected. In order to adapt to a situation, to survive, to embrace future, a new future, to thrive, and also to change society. Bearing in mind that we are facing a different generation. This is what they call a post-materialistic generation, which means that jobs, income, status are not always their major concern. And this is happening everywhere, everywhere. Even more so, fewer jobs, fewer startup opportunities after pandemic. It's a post-truth society, which is unfortunate, but it's a reality. Living in virtual societies, friends wide and far, but closed. They live in echo chambers. Right? Self-selecting information, self-fulfilling stories is overwhelming their lives. Hence, education should be about learning because they have to face everything new, everything changing, everything suspicious, rather than only credentials. But our education system is fundamentally about credentials. We have to move away from credential only. I'm not so sure if we can get rid of credentials, but some students are not bound by credentials. We have to bear that in mind. After all, the new normal is a new paradigm. If you stay in the old normal, everything is going to be difficult because it's no longer the case. But if we take change and uncertainty for granted, then new opportunities and new windows are everywhere. Everywhere for students' better learning. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Professor Chang. May we now invite Justin to share with us?
Sure. Well, it's a terrific honor. I mean, especially to follow Kai-Ming, Professor Chang. I, want to echo so many of the things that he said, particularly, his analysis of schools, the phases they've gone through, the circumstances they face, the extraordinary work and the extraordinary learning that teachers have done during this period, the extraordinary self-directed learning that students have done during this period. In the United States, we see very, very similar things. I want to try to make 2 points about consistency and about change, and maybe put one finer point on something that Kai-Ming said about the conditions under which self-directed learning can happen. In the United States, schools shut down in March. And March was when the copy edits were due for this book that I've just published, Failure to Disrupt: Why Technology Alone Can't Transform Education. And I can tell you it's quite unnerving trying to get a book published on the cusp of a pandemic, especially when a book tries to say something to the education community about what the future will look like. And to be sitting there knowing that in all kinds of ways, the future is going to be very different. And I remember in March going through the book and thinking to myself, man, is there anything that's going to really embarrass me 6 months from now? Is there anything that I'm going to look back and go, oh gosh, you said that this was the case for years and years, but now it's all, completely different. And I will say that I still don't, I'm sure there are things that are wrong in the book, but I don't feel that there are things that are sort of dramatically wrong because of the pandemic. In part because the book made a claim that people who see the education system as ripe for disruption, as ripe for transformative change, they're just consistently wrong. The group of people that I study most in these circumstances are education technology entrepreneurs. And education technology entrepreneurs have a set of incentives and motivations for talking about a profoundly different world. So there's a Harvard Business School professor, Clay Christensen, who in 2009 said that by 2019, half of all courses will be online. They'll be a third of the cost and have better learning outcomes. Think about this in terms of what Professor Chang said about the importance of social learning. In higher education, Sebastian Thrun, who's a researcher at Google and Stanford, said that in 50 years, there'd only be 10 institutions of higher education left. These sort of 10 elite mega institutions kind of farming out their learning experiences created by elites to provinces all around the world. Sal Khan in 2011 said, let's use video to reinvent education. Instead of having teachers teach math classes, let's have individual students sit in front of computer terminals and have a kind of algorithmically optimized mathematics learning experience, supplemented by teachers gathering students to do project-based learning and enrichment and things like that. And then I don't know if he was well known in Hong Kong, but for a short time in the United States and in the UK, there was a professor named Sugata Mitra who won the 2013 TED Prize. And he maybe went further than any of them. He said, you don't even need schools or institutions of learning. If you just give kids laptops and the internet, they can teach anything themselves. And it's not, this is not a shorthand. Finally, the most startling of them all, groups of children with access to the internet can learn anything by themselves. For anyone who has sat at home with children over the last 9 months, they cannot learn anything by themselves. This is like well established now in our schools and homes and families. But the claim behind all of this was that we were on the cusp of a transformed educational system because new forms of education technology were going to be able to replace an aging, infirm, and inappropriate school system. And then the world was blighted by a terrible pandemic. 1.6 billion learners all around the world went home. And what happened? It was not these new technologies that filled the void of children going home. My hunch is that in your schools, having never been to Hong Kong and having not talked to very many people about it, my hunch still is that you have not turned your children over to massive open online courses. You have not sat them down extensively in front of adaptive tutors. You have not adopted virtual reality or artificial intelligence or other things. My hunch is that in your schools, there are two technologies you've adopted more than any others, perhaps supplemented by some other things, and you please tell me if I'm wrong. But around the world, what we're seeing is two technologies primarily being used, and they're two of the very oldest technologies that we have. Education technology we have. So the first is learning management systems, things like Google Classroom and Canvas and Schoology. These are tools for passing documents back and forth between teachers and students. They were theorized in the 1960s and 70s. They were commercialized in the 1990s. They were made open source in the 2000s. And then the second technology is one that when it was first introduced in the 1930s was called video telephony. And that's what we're using right now to talk with one another, although perhaps not to be fully co-present with one another. And these are things like the Zoom that we're using or Microsoft Teams or Google Hangouts, or you may have other more popular options in China, but they allow people to communicate with one another at a distance. And what the particular attractive feature of this combination of technologies is they are the pair of things that let us, as closely as possible, replicate schools and classrooms as they existed before the pandemic. What we have overwhelmingly, as Professor Cheng said, tried to do, one way to think about it is, especially in secondary schools, especially in higher education, teachers walked away from their lecterns and they sat down in front of their home office webcams, and they tried as much as they could to keep teaching the way they were before. If you are an evangelist of profound transformation in schools, that's probably a huge disappointment. If you are a loyalist to the education system who believes that over hundreds or thousands of years in your part of the world, schools have been honed to, as best as possible, optimize the many conflicting demands that society puts on them, you might say, well, yeah, we recreated the thing that we had beforehand. The thing that we had beforehand was pretty good. It was hard to make. But I think one of the things that we can just say objectively and descriptively, I think we will not have in our lifetimes a more powerful demonstration of the conservatism of educational systems than what we've seen over the last 9 months. That overwhelmingly people have tried to recreate what they have before. And we can decide whether that consistency is good or bad, but I think we should think of that as one of our starting points. And I will say that at least one of the EdTech evangelists that I mentioned to you before, as I watch his thinking evolve, has come to be more accommodating of this kind of acknowledgement of the conservatism of education system. So my hunch is a bunch of you have seen one of Sal Khan's TED Talks. It is much less likely that you read his January 31 interview in District Administrator magazine, published in the United States for school superintendents. And I'm pretty sure that like me and 5 other people have read this article. But one of the things that Sal Khan says, one of the things he did in between starting Khan Academy and now, is that he formed a school called the Khan Lab School, and he tried to have it be a laboratory where he implemented, his most ambitious ideas in a private school, where in the Bay Area, where students were paying $20,000 or $25,000 a year to be there. And as he acknowledged last year, it didn't work. I see now that some of the stuff is not as easy to accomplish compared to how it sounds theoretically. It's taken me and the Khan Academy a long time to realize this, but we can't completely reconfigure our schools into mastery-based, self-paced learning. In fact, what we're recommending now is that we should have students do regular math class 4 days a week, and then they should do online practice problems 1 day a week. And that's a nice blend. That's a nice combination of a little bit of new things and some old, well-established things. My hunch, that may resonate for a bunch of you, that as you've transitioned your math classes to this new online or blended format, like you're doing a little bit more online practice problems, you're doing a little bit more Dreambox or ST Math or whatever it is you're doing. But you have not turned your children and their math instruction entirely over to the algorithms, that you still see a tremendous virtue in humans and adults interacting with them and peers interacting with each other. But one of the things that struck me about Sal Khan's argument was that it had been made in the middle of the 1990s. So Ken Kadinger, who's a great faculty member at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh in the 1990s, did this project where they made a computerized adaptive tutor. It wasn't online, but it was on machines. And they tried to get teachers to do it 3 days a week, but the teachers would, they tried to get the teachers to do 3 days a week of regular teaching and 2 days a week of computer-based practice problems. And the teachers wouldn't do it. They would do 4 days a week of regular teaching and 1 day a week of practice problems. And it worked a little bit, not dramatic, not utterly transformative of systems, but people found ways of extending and improving the existing system, starting to think new ways about technology adoption, about how they spend their time, about how they distribute work between individual and whole class and machines and humans. And one consequence is that I think we should pay attention to the fact that Khan Academy spent $150 million of philanthropic investment to learn something that they could have found out by going to the library. But I think it's a tribute to a different perspective on how schools get better. So here are two sort of ways of thinking about, if one thing to think about is the extraordinary consistency of education systems, here's two ways of thinking about change. And these two come from a colleague of mine, Morgan Ames, who wrote a really wonderful book called The Charisma Machine, The Life, Death, and Legacy of One Laptop Per Child. And certainly one of the things that you heard Professor Kai-Ming say, is, we've now reached the point where every student, it's not enough for schools to have computers. Every child needs to have access to a computer. And this is certainly, idea that the MIT Media Lab advanced a long time ago. Although the way that they did it, I think, was not particularly successful. But one of the things that the folks who did the One Laptop Per Child they thought about computers in the same way that Sal Khan thought about them in 2011, which Morgan Ames describes as a charismatic stance. This notion that technology has the capacity to disrupt and transform systems, and the future will be brand new and different because of new technology. I mean, if you went to Sal Khan in 2012 and said, 8 years from now, there's going to be a global pandemic that shuts down all the schools, I'm confident he would have said to you, well, that's going to be terrible and very sad, but boy, are you going to see profoundly different school systems on the other side of it. And I'm not sure that he would say that today. Another stance that we can take towards the improving of schools is the tinkering stance. And this is the notion that technology doesn't disrupt systems. Systems domesticate new technologies. Our technologies are not like Swiss Army knives or bulldozers that sort of solve every problem or knock everything away. They're very particular tools that they work well in some subjects, but not others, for some students, but not others, in some contexts, but not others. And if you want to understand the future, it's an extension of trends from history. My prediction is online learning has been growing at a steady clip for a long time. There's much more of it in higher education. There's some of it that's been coming to K-12. It's been blended in different ways into schools. All of that blending and change has happened much, much more slowly in early education. And there are a number of reasons for that have to do with motivation. That for those of you who are teaching kindergartners and first graders, you also know this has to do with like fine motor control, and the executive function to be able to do multi-step operations on computers and things like that. But my hunch is that there are going to be very few places in the world that we look to and go, wow, things were completely different after the pandemic. And there might be a few places that try, and that might be worth aiming for. But I think we'll see many, many more places that take some of the gains and some of the bright spots that have happened against the backdrop of a horrific global tragedy, and say, we're going to weave these in a little bit better into our future. We're gonna take this surge of self-directed learning that we see, and we're going to celebrate it. We're going to find more room for it. And we're going to have more trust and confidence in our students, having seen what they're capable of, many of them with us at a distance. And I think, part of what I try to do in the book, Failure to Disrupt, is to celebrate this tinkering stance, is to say, we absolutely can come out of this pandemic with schools, with teachers that are stronger. It will not just be because individual teachers got better. And this is something, enormously important that Kai-Ming said as well. Schools are not going to get better on their own if all that happens if teachers individually improve. Certainly one of the things that we're seeing in the United States is this grotesque, this embarrassing, this shameful inequality in the family learning environments and the resources that students are provided. Certainly as educators, but I think also as citizens, we have a tremendous responsibility to agitate and to be advocates for these children and their families, and say, this is not the last pandemic. If you were a kindergartner this year, this is not going to be the last global pandemic that you face in your lifetime. Because of climate change, because of the climate emergency, we're going to see more pandemics. We're going to see more heat-related events. We're going to see more extreme weather events. Our school systems, need to be more robust to interrupted schooling around the world. And part of that means making sure that families have the resources to continue learning for their children. And it should not be entirely the role of schools to do that. Schools are not supply chain managers at heart. There are other institutions in society that can be responsible for making sure that every home is connected to broadband internet, and every family has a laptop. Now, as we think about all of this change, I will give you one other caution, and this is another point that Kai-Ming made. I think it makes a lot of sense to aim for more self-directed learning. I think it makes a lot of sense to aim for more social learning. But a point too was that if you want to make room for those things, something else in the system has to give. As all of you who are exhausted working 150% teachers know right now, change cannot be universally additive. There have to be strategic ways that we take things away, that we look back at the past. Some of my colleagues have referred to this only sort of jokingly as Marie Kondoing our schools and Marie Kondoing our curriculum. I assume that many of you know the great organizational thinker in terms of home organization, Marie Kondo. And she has this routine for getting things out of our houses and our closets, which is you put your hand on something and you see if it sparks joy. And if that shirt doesn't spark joy, you fold it and you say thank you to it and you give it away. We have to do this same ritual in our schools. We have to put our hands on the curriculum, our hands on our routines, our hands on the lesson plans, and ask ourselves, does this spark joy? And if not, we have to fold it and we have to thank it and we have to make it go away, so that we can make room for new kinds of practices. So as creative and imaginative as we are in coming up with new routines and new ideas, we will have to be equally creative and imaginative in what we choose to take away. I wanted to make one other fine point on something that Professor Chang said about self-directed learning, that I just want to emphasize that not all students live in circumstances that effectively support self-directed learning. As my local elementary school principal said, we used to have one building where 285 students came together. We now have 285 different homes in which we're supporting learning. The field of self-directed learning has really been studied and advanced a lot by education psychologists who are quite interested in individual traits. They're interested in this question like, what do we need to teach individual children so that their brains can be prepared and honed for doing good individual self-paced, self-directed learning? But I think one of the things that we're learning strongly during the pandemic is that you can only do effective self-directed learning if you have a space and have the tools with which to do that. And society has a role to play. Our governments, our civil institutions, our municipalities have a role to play in if we simply ask schools and teachers and individual students to do more self-directed learning, we'll find that it happens much more effectively in students who live in affluent homes than in students who live in more crowded homes with fewer resources and those kinds of things. So I think as much as we think about these sort of individual conditions of classrooms and teachers and students, it's important too, just as Professor Chang pointed to at the end, to think about some of these broader changes in society that are shaping and what's possible and who it's possible for. I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Justin. Let's move into the Q&A session. And if anyone in our audience would like to ask our speakers any questions, you can leave them in the chat box. We'll also leave some time for those who would like to unmute and speak up as well. But for now, allow me to kick things off with a few questions. I think it's a very interesting sharing that the two of you have. In my view, Professor Chang has a slightly more optimistic and encouraging report of what has happened in Hong Kong, while Justin has more of a sobering and cautious stance of saying that how things have still very much stayed the same in many ways. Both of you have touched on the term self-directed learning. And while we recognize that there's a lot of circumstances that we can't control and requires collaboration from different stakeholders, when it comes to educators, what would your advice be for them in supporting that, in helping students on this self-directed journey?
Well, I don't mind starting briefly just to say that there's lots of good research that suggests that almost everyone adolescent age and above in the networked world is actually quite good at interest-driven online learning. I'm sure all of you can think of students who have learned a ton from makeup tutorials about how to beat levels in a video game, about how to pursue hobbies, fan fiction writing. There are all kinds of extraordinary ways that young people are teaching themselves online all the time. What we find, unfortunately, is that when we ask them to bring those same skills and that same motivation to school curriculum, it doesn't work nearly as well. For our most adept learners, online schooling is self-directed learning comes pretty naturally. Kids who would do well anywhere do well online. And then we find increasingly what some have described as an online penalty, which is that students from who are less well supported by the traditional educational system do less well with this kind of independent, self-directed online learning. And some of this we can ameliorate by providing more support, by providing instruction, by building societies where people have the support to do that. I also want to emphasize, one of the things that I heard in Professor Cheng's talk was, and this might square some of the differences we saw, extraordinary innovation by individual teachers. I absolutely think that's happened. I think we've seen much less extraordinary innovation at the school level or at the system level. If you want to let students pursue their interest-driven learning, there have to be curriculum changes that make more time for that. It can't simply be, we're going to do everything that we did before and X. I think now during the pandemic, when we know that, students in this academic year are not going to learn as much as they learned in previous years, our system's going to step up, our ministers, our heads of education ministries, departments going to step up and talk about what that strategic reduction looks like, or are they going to leave it in the hands of individual teachers? So those are some of the thoughts I have on how we might spark and support that, not just in classrooms, but in whole systems.
Could I respond to Angela's question? I have removed optimism, pessimism in my dictionary. So I'm not doing any, but I try to be positive in understanding what is happening and what will happen to understand. And about self-directed learning, I think two types of schools in Hong Kong are should be most ready for self-directed learning. One are those schools which their students will have no opportunity of going into universities at all. Then they can, anyway, we have no hope. Then let us move on something more positive, more useful. And this is happening. I've seen quite a few schools in the northern part of Hong Kong where they come from very poor families and very poor background, and they have little hope of going to university, although eventually they may go to higher education in their lifetime. But then they are totally free from examination pressure. I don't want to say totally, from examination pressure, and they have a lot of room for other things, like a 3D kind of a cartoon, animation. Even they can do experiments, scientific experiments that universities professors are doing. The second type of schools, which are more apt for self-directed learning, are the schools we are facing here. I presume, now I hope I'm not wrong, the schools here are among the best academically achieving schools in Hong Kong, right? I taught at St. Paul's. My daughter is a graduate of St. Stephen's. My grandson is in DBS. So I can see that these are the places where you don't have to do a lot of additional effort to make students going into good universities. If that is the case, then if you have a little additional effort, time and energy, why don't you spend on something else? On self-directed learning. And I think that is totally possible. I normally I don't draw in my family members. It's unfair. It's privacy. But my grandson is in now primary 3. Last year primary 2 during the pandemic, and he's not a very attentive student. You know, primary 2 and only two months in. But he has read in 2 weeks all the 7 volumes of Harry Potter with no instruction, no help. I don't know why. I scratch my head. If that is the case, what has happened? It means that if you give them room, they can do a lot. My grandchild is not a genius at all. It's just a normal kid. I think, but you give them the opportunity, they can do it. It's a matter of whether they can give them the room. If you trust them, they trust themselves. You don't trust them, they don't trust themselves. And this is also related to David's question, David from St. Stephen's. Do we see students as products or as persons? Yes, this is fundamental. I think our education system, yes, we do have schools, as Justin said, we do have schools in China a long time ago, but they are not schools like this. The first schools in US, I visited Sturbridge in Cambridge, in Massachusetts, living the life of 1836. I asked the teacher, I played a student and sat in her class. I said, why are students coming here? Oh, because they want to work in Boston. So they have to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic. So that was the beginning. They are there because they want to have these skills. But this is no longer the case now. This is why I said society has changed. The society is much more challenging than reading, writing, arithmetic. Of course, you have to do reading, writing, arithmetic, but you cannot overwhelm students' lives with reading, writing, arithmetic, and you're depriving them. It's kind of a criminal. You're depriving them of more important learning. I'm sorry, it's too long an answer.
No, but I think you touched on a very important point of providing more room and space for students. And what Justin has also previously talked about is touching on the idea of less is more and Maria Kondo way of thinking of doing less. On that point, what do you two feel are some things that educators should actually do less of these days?
I don't have an answer, but I think the teachers in the audience will have an answer. They all have different answers. I think it's a matter of a strategy. Strategy to me means 4 things: importance, urgency, sequence, and trade-offs. That is what Justin mentioned. In Chinese, in Cantonese, it's easy. It says, 向從緩急先後取捨. But if you don't give, you don't take. It's like running, jogging. If you don't breathe out, how can you breathe in? And that is the reality. But what I'm saying is that from the schools that I'm looking at on the screen, they should have plenty of room for doing things. So just giving students their own space. When I taught in St. Paul's, that was more than 30 years ago. Form 2, that is 7th grade. I was teaching mathematics, and the student came to me and said, "Sir, your mathematics is too easy for me. I want to do calculus." and so they can do this. They can do this, but if you don't allow them time, they have to work until 11 o'clock for homework. Then how can they do it? And of course, as Justin said, we also have to inform parents to let go, because parents in Hong Kong are not like parents in the United States. Sometimes parents will say that don't give them so many homework. This is home time. It's our family time. But in Hong Kong, parents will say, tell me what I have to do to help my student with their homework. And that is not very helpful. I'm going to some parents' meetings. The first thing I would say, my first advice is let go. And second advice is let go. The third advice is let go. You have to let go. But if we want parents to let go, we teachers have to be mindful of what the limit that students have to spend their time, right? And I think the families here are in some families, if you don't have any, if there's disharmony in the home, then it's a totally different story. But that may not apply to the parents in this group of schools.
I wonder whether, yeah, sure, please go ahead.
This issue of what to get rid of came up quite a bit at MIT in March when we said, you know, our leadership said definitively to the faculty, you will not, for the rest of the semester, teach what you normally teach. There's 8 weeks left in the semester. You won't teach the same amount of 8 weeks. You're going to have to reduce. And so it gets you thinking critically about, all right, so, you know, there's a reason why we can't say cut this and this and this and this and this. And it's because from kindergarten through 12th grade, in however many dozens of subjects you have in the Hong Kong curriculum, there are all kinds of different answers, but there are strategic ways of answering these questions. There's one kind of course that we teach in which we sample from a canon. So those of you who teach literature will have very little difficulty with this question of what to get rid of, because you every year you make exceedingly painful choices about what to leave out. You know, if you teach a class on English literature, you're just not going to teach all of the great writers in English. And if you've discovered over the last, 10 or 15 years that when we teach English literature, we actually, disproportionately teach white European men, and we don't include enough voices from underrepresented minorities and from women, you're already used to sort of yanking things out, and you just say, okay, well, like we used to teach a Shakespeare class and we do, 2 tragedies and 2 comedies and 4 sonnets. And this year we're going to do 2 tragedies and 1 comedy and 3 sonnets. And that's okay. You're not like not Shakespeare enough if you do that anymore. It's harder to do. It's less possible to do idiosyncratically well in courses that are sequenced. So a computer science 2 teacher is depending on the computer science 1 teacher to have made certain choices about what to teach in a way that the world literature teacher is probably not depending upon the English literature teacher for their sequence, because they're used to sort of sampling out of a canon. In the social studies and history, I think we dramatically underestimate how much we could sample from a canon. In the US, we're like obsessed with trying to cover every event that happened in US history. And it gets harder and harder every year because there's 1 more year's worth of stuff, except this year when there was like 15 years more worth of stuff. But it's actually not that hard. You just skip periods. you discover if they didn't get the Industrial Revolution, it's okay. Like it was better that you instead spent 7 extra days on something else than like 1 day on everything. And I think there are many other fields that can think of themselves as, let's think of ourselves as less having to essentially cover an entire sequence and more sampling out of a canon. My colleague Jal Mehta wrote a book called In Search of Deeper Learning, where he studied very different kinds of schools with very different pedagogical philosophies. But one thing in common is that they all tried to do fewer things well. The pandemic is a great time to recognize that some of the best schools in the world are really committed to doing fewer things well.
Yes. Could I respond to one question, which is very meaningful, is how self-directed learning and traditional learning are related? I don't think they are a kind of black and white dichotomy. My understanding of self-directed learning have 3 levels. One is the traditional way, or the way or notion of motivation. They have to do this, and it is up to you. You have to ask them to do this. This is very, very basic. This is very important. This is for examination, for example. Then you have to do motivation, meaning increase the incentive, the interests, so that they can be happy in learning that. The second level is choice. Give them some choice. Once they have a choice, then it is rather different. But the third one is autonomy. Give them autonomy. But in all these cases, I don't think self-directed learning would mean getting rid of teachers. It's only that teachers are playing different roles. I can give you one example in a very simple, regular private primary schools in Hong Kong. It's very famous for learning. The 10 students in the group are given a task. Next week, they have to perform 3 little pigs. 10. So the students are left alone. Teacher said, don't ask me what to do, how to do it. You do it. So the students discussed and found that we have 10, but there are only 5 figures in 5 rows. 3 pigs, the mother, and the wolf. So let us change the story. So they rewrite the story and create 2 dogs. And then they select the rows and so on and so forth. Eventually, they want to test the rows, but one dog could not bark. They said, you can't bark. How can you play dog? So eventually, they decided to get to replace the dog and so on and so forth. It's a long story. The whole process, teacher has no intervention at all, but they are learning. They're learning what we learn in management schools: decision making, resource allocation, crisis management. All that is learned, right? If a student in a year can have 10 such opportunities, they will be a totally different student. So I'm not saying, so it is under the teacher. Teacher designs that for them. That's why I said teacher has to be the learning designer, but you have to give way. I know there are a group of parents who start a program called Learning by Doing, LBD. And schools that join them are basically primary schools, would have a total empty, kind of vacant afternoons to do whatever they want and things that students feel interested. So there are all kinds of opportunities. For example, in St. Paul's, where I taught, the students find their own space because they're so able to cover whatever you teach. They have created their own space at home on learning whatever they want. And so I think trust the students and encourage self-directed learning is at least what teachers can do. But self-directed learning has to be designed. I think self-directed learning doesn't mean that teacherless learning. It's not like a motor car now. It's a self-driving car. Right. I don't think so.
I've actually received a question not about student learning, but more about teacher learning from Dr. Percy Kwok from Logos Academy, asking about the directions for school-based professional teacher development. What do you feel like moving forward teachers should look for in equipping themselves and learning? In that regard, what's your quick comment on that?
Well, this is something that we focus on entirely in our lab. One of the things we're going to have to get better at as a society is online learning for teachers. As groups of folks, people who tend to be good at online learning are sort of already educated, already affluent people. The best way to become really good at independent self-directed learning is a really good apprenticeship in the formal education system, which teachers have. So teachers are in a good position to learn online. And there's a bunch of work that we do in our lab. You can visit at tsl.mit.edu, where we're trying to figure out how can we do anti-racist equity teaching? How can we do change leadership? How can we do really difficult learning experiences online? But even as we add more online, I think something that certainly places like Hong Kong are much better at than the United States is that teacher learning also has to be collaborative. When teachers only get better in their own individual classrooms, they retire, they move on to new schools, and they got better, but their systems didn't get any better. That learning got lost. And so figuring out how teacher learning happens collaboratively at the grade level, at the department level, at the school level, whatever it is, that I think is a really important part of making durable change.
Yes, I will echo that. I think it has to be collaborative. And if you go for science of learning, human beings learn in groups. It's a kind of learning is a cognitive, it's a social condition, and that is important. But first of all, what is now gathering here is already a learning community, and thanks to MIT's help. The second one is teachers. No, teachers are just part of society. I don't think there's any part of society that people don't have to learn. No part. So when I say teachers are so busy. Teachers are kind of like prompted to learn. Well, everybody in society has to learn, because you cannot do whatever you did yesterday for tomorrow, because things are changing technology, changing clients, changing market, changing notions, and so on and so forth. So what is happening is soon will soon disappear. But I think this pandemic has demonstrated that teachers can learn very quickly. And I don't think we need to ask a question to assume that teachers are not learning. But second, teachers learning in schools are very different to different people. Many schools demonstrated that those who are rather timid otherwise, who are young and inexperienced, may become a champion in applying technology. But those who are more senior may play another role. So the learning community thing is so important. Justine may not know that, because we are not only facing pandemic, we are also facing political unrest, and teachers might split in political ideology, but they don't split in facing students. Many schools told me, almost all schools told me, that in pandemic, the teacher community becomes closer, more harmonious. And that is what is happening. So I'm not trying to be optimistic, but I'm just telling you the reality.
Right. I think being conscious of the time, I'm afraid we'll have to end the Q&A session now. But I just want to give one last opportunity for both of you to make a very quick final remark. Is there one thing that you want our audience to think about, or please keep it short, one thing that you want to get across as a closing for both of you?
Just my enormous gratitude for the work that teachers and school leaders and other folks are doing right now under extremely difficult conditions. As I've talked to teachers in lots of different places, I've often joked, your work is so important because you never know when my kids might be there. And sure enough, this year we ended up moving to a little town in rural Vermont where I had worked with teachers in the past, and said, I don't know when we're moving to Hong Kong, but it could be soon. And so I'm enormously grateful for the long hours, the extended professional learning, the risk, the challenges, all of the difficult things that teachers are doing to making this work right now. I mean, my hat is really off, and my heart is with all of you trying to serve your students as best you can.
Yeah, I wouldn't only want to say that for the schools that I'm familiar with, I'm glad that you are taking the lead in this, pioneering in this direction, because the whole world is being reorganized. Those that are strong might become weak, and those that are weak might become strong. You have been among the strongest, and now you can still go on as the leader in the education community. Yes, thank you very much for this opportunity, and thank you very much for shedding light on my thinking.